Hello! In this video, we're going to continue to talk about the Moog Matriarch's VCA modes, envelope generators, and LFOs, and I'll talk you through how to put together the patch I'm playing now. I'm going to talk primarily about split mode this time, but we'll cover whatever we need to as it comes up while putting this patch together, and I'm going to do one more video in a couple of weeks, which is going to cover primarily drone mode. There's an index and links to patch diagrams in the description. And by the way, I'd like to really thank all the people who have purchased a patch book. I should have done that a while ago. It's been out a year now and I'm still getting orders, which is great. It takes a lot of time and work to put these videos together, and I really appreciate your support. Okay, let's get to it. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off in the last video. If you haven't seen that, you might want to check that one out first, but here's a patch diagram if you want to just jump right in. A few people have asked, why bother with a looping envelope for a pulse? Why not use the sequencer? You'd certainly have more control. Well, yeah, but the sound is slightly different with a looping envelope pulse. It's an AR envelope instead of ADSR with the sequencer. You could turn gate length on the sequencer to 0 and sustain all the way down, and it would be basically the same, I guess. But the main difference, I guess, would be that in amp envelope mode with the looping envelope, pressing the keys allows you to use sustain and decay if you want. And what's the fun in always doing things the same way anyway? Oh, and one other point, it frees up the sequencer to be used for something else. So I'm going to get back to that later in the video. Okay, let's switch over to split mode. That's going to be the main focus of this video. In VCA Split Mode, the filter envelope generator modulates VCA channel 1 and amp envelope generator modulates VCA channel 2. And you probably already hear that, but let's solo each side and take a listen to what's going on. Here's channel 1. Filter envelope generator has a long attack and long release, so we're getting a swell. And the amp envelope, short attack, so we're getting a pulse. And just like amp envelope mode, in split mode, the filter envelope generator modulates both filter channels. It would be kind of neat if in split mode the amp envelope generator modulated filter channel 2, but that's something that we're going to talk about in a second anyway. I'm going to switch into Duophonic mode and just play for a little bit. This is a cool sounding patch. I really like the swell and pulse and that they're out of time or out of phase, but makes it a little tricky to play. You have to time things just right, but still, nice, simple, good sounding patch. Okay, but let's sort out the filter modulation. Again, I like the simple version, but let's set it up the way you'd think split mode would work. Amp envelope generator modulating filter and VCA for channel 2. And filter envelope generator for filter and VCA for channel 1. So patching envelope out of the amp envelope generator into an attenuator, which will control the amount of modulation, and then we'll patch into filter to CV in. Oh, and you got to make sure that we turn off the amp envelope knob on the filter, or else the filter envelope will still modulate both filters. Okay, so I've got channel 2 soloed, and you can hear that the amp envelope generator is now modulating the filter. So let's do the same thing with channel 1. So I'm patching out of the mold, which has got our filter envelope generator patched into it, into another attenuator, and then, yeah, you guessed it, into filter CV input for channel 1. Yeah, and that's giving the patch a little more clarity. Almost sounds like two separate voices, which I guess it kind of is. Let's make that swell a little bit more pronounced. Yeah, that's nice. The patch is cleaner, but now it's harder to play because with the brighter filter modulation that's still out of phase, it's almost impossible to time key presses so they won't be halfway through a swell. Although I guess I did do it a couple of times there. Oh well, let's try to sort that out anyway. So So let's unpatch the envelope generators so we can think for a second. Okay, this is a bit of a rat's nest up here. Let me clean this up a bit. I like the offset filter swell, especially if the cutoff is low. It's nice that it's not in time with the pulse, less predictable, but doesn't work as well with the brighter filter sweep. We could, of course, try to match the envelope speeds by adjusting attack or release time on the filter envelope, but that's pretty tricky, and getting two analog LFOs perfectly in time is almost impossible. Okay, so I've cleaned this up a little bit. I've patched the trigger inputs for both envelope generators into the mult and removed the pulse width rate modulation for now, and just patched the filter envelope directly into the attenuator to modulate filter 1. Okay, to solve the timing issues, let's use an LFO to trigger both envelope generators, patching square LFO out to the mult. Oh, and I gotta go back into split mode. Okay, so the left channel's coming through nice and clear, but we're just getting clicks from the right channel. Let's compare our envelope end out and square LFO, which I use to loop the envelopes, to see why we're getting different behavior. Top trace on the scope is going to be our envelope output, and let's start with the envelope end out on the bottom. Let me get these cables out of the way so we can see what's going on. A bit messy. It's pretty clear that the envelope end out is a trigger output, which explains why when we looped the envelope by patching end out to trigger in, sustain and decay had no effect. A trigger is just like the name suggests, a quick start signal. And now I'll patch the square LFO into the trigger input and our scope. So now the envelope is sending what just looks like a trigger. So what's up with that? So to explain this, let's take a quick look at the parameters of an envelope. Let's look at an ASR envelope first, like the one on the Mother 32, for instance. It's a bit easier to understand. An ASR envelope has attack, sustain, and release parameters. Attack and release are time values, while sustain is a level value. If the envelope is modulating a VCA, for instance, then the sustain value controls the output level or volume, whereas the attack is the amount of time it takes for the envelope to move from a level of 0 when it receives a trigger to the sustain value. And release then is the time it takes to move from the sustain value back down to 0. Now let's take a look at an ADSR envelope like the one we have on the Matriarch. Attack, sustain, and release behave the same, but decay is a little different. It's a time value like attack and release, but it's also a level value like sustain. So if we take a look at our scope again, that should all become clear. Although this scope isn't that great for LFOs, it's a bit slow, but you'll get the idea. With decay and sustain values at 0, we'll get a short trigger-like signal from our envelope because the level is 0. Release is going to have no effect because the level is technically 0. What we're actually seeing is the fixed decay level bump. Decay is a level, but it's a fixed level on the Matriarch. The decay knob just controls the decay time value. Since the decay time is at 0, release has no effect. If we keep attack, decay, and release at 0 but raise the sustain, we'll have an envelope that mirrors the LFO, with sustain setting the level, and you can still see that little decay level bump. Cool. If we raise the attack and release times, we'll get something similar to an ASR envelope, but the decay bump is really clear now. There it is. So attack is now the time it takes for the level to move from 0 to the top of the decay level. And the decay knob, of course, controls the time it takes to fall back to the sustain level. Let's move the sustain down a bit to make that clearer. If sustain is at 0, then we again get an AR-like shape. But now with decay controlling release and replacing the release knob. So with the sustain at 0, the release knob is redundant. Release is the amount of time it takes to return from sustain level to 0. If sustain is 0, so is release. Okay, so let's get this back to the way it was. So both trigger inputs for the envelope generators are patched in the mult, and the output of the envelope generators are modulating the filter. And lastly, the square LFO is patched into the mult to trigger the envelopes. Okay, with decay and sustain up on the amp envelope, everything's working the way we expected. Just make some quick adjustments to the tempo using the LFO rate knob. And I can adjust the amount of filter modulation with the attenuators. And remember, because we're modulating the filter with unipolar LFOs, we're not going to get any negative filter modulation, so use the spacing knob and filter cutoff knobs to set the lowest point you want for your cutoff, and the modulation will always be above that. And the secret sauce. And our filter sweep and pulse are in time and linked, and it sounds good. It's different than the other one that's offset, but cleaner, easier to play. But the delay is a little bit out of time. But you know what, with analog delay, ooh, nice. It doesn't bother me a lot of the time if it's slightly out of time. Maybe it's because just the lushness of the delay, maybe it's because the repeats on the Matriarch's delay do progressively get darker, so it's not as noticeable. Whatever the reason, it sounds great to me no matter what the delay time is. I found the same thing with my Space Echo, so maybe it's an analog thing or maybe it's just a placebo, I don't know. Anyway, the next step of our patch is going to be to sync the delay, partly so we can just prove that we know how to do it. Whew, that's cool. And partly because I might be the only one that likes it when it's out of time. So on the back of the Matriarch, we have a sync input, gonna plug into that. Not using a mult cable for any particular reason, just grabbed one. But I do think we're gonna use this LFO for a bunch of other things. So it's plugged into the mult already. Instead of plugging directly into that mult, I'm gonna plug into the other mult and then patch a cable from one mult to the other, just so we've got extra copies of that LFO if need be. So it's easy as that. The delay is now synced to the LFO. The delay time knob now becomes a division knob, although it can be a little bit finicky, I've found, with LFOs, especially bipolar LFOs, so you have to kind of nudge it sometimes. Cool. Okay, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that one of the benefits of using a looping envelope generator, or LFO, to trigger our pulse is that it frees up our sequencer for other things. So we're going to go into global settings and get things all set up. So the first thing we're going to do is turn off local sequencer control, that's C#2, F#1, and C0. Then we're going to turn off sequence keyboard control, which is D#2, A#0. That stops the keyboard from transposing our sequence and allows us to just play it by pushing the play button. And lastly, we're going to turn ARP sequence clock input mode to step advance, D#2, C#0. That just makes the sequencer advance through the steps whenever it receives a high gate signal. I'm going to use the sequencer as a CV sequencer, not for pitch, so I'm going to record a simple sequence with extreme values for now so it'll be easy to hear. And from the back of the Matriarch, I'm going to patch into the arpeggiator clock input, and I'm plugging that into our mult, which is, of course, our LFO. Quickly back to the global settings with the sequencer step advance we just did. If using an LFO to clock the Matriarch's arpeggiator, it's not necessary to set the global settings to step advance, but I've found that you do get some odd behavior at times when clocking the Matriarch with a bipolar LFO. This seems to sort that out. So the sequencer is going to be advanced by the LFO. Okay, you know what? Let's go into 4-voice mode. Play some chords. Sounds nice. Okay, let's patch out of the sequencer. And you know what? Just so we can hear it, I'm going to patch into a pitch input so we can hear it. Oh, and you got to push play on the sequencer, of course. Yep, there we go. So the sequencer is working. Okay, that worked. So I'm going to use this to modulate the delay feedback. So I'm just going to bring the feedback down a little bit and plug it right in there. And patching feedback, you know, it can get crazy, especially if you use really large values like I did on the keyboard. So I'm just going to dial back the feedback knob at first, find a place that I like it from our extreme values, which I'm hoping for is going to be a lot of feedback and almost no feedback. There's no feedback. No feedback to medium amount. That's good. Sweet. Now I could just record in a different sequence if I wanted to, one with less extreme values. See if that works a bit better. I think that might be a little bit more musical. I'm going to go with that one. And the delay isn't totally in sync. I could monkey around with it, but I'm just going to leave it where it is for now. What did I play? A D major? You know what? That just doesn't sound like a D major. Oh, I've still got the oscillators offset in pitch. So I'm going to bring those back into tune so we're getting... Oh, I like that little pitch drop. That gives me an idea for later. I really like this patch. I'm not exactly sure what I'd call it. A 4-voice pulse drone with delay modulation? I don't know. Doesn't sound very cool though. Gotta come up with something better than that. Oh well, this is where I was going to end the patch, but that little pitch swoop that happened when I changed the pitch of oscillator 4 gave me an idea. So what if we could somehow make it so that pitch swoop happens automatically? So I think the envelope generator is the best way to go with this. So I'm going to patch the envelope out into a mult. It's just a cheap external mult you can get at any synth store. So repatching the envelope modulation where it was, and the other end of the mult goes into an attenuator. Oops, no, I didn't patch it to where it was. That's a mistake. I patched that wrong. So where did I go wrong? Oh, that's feeding the mult, out of the mult into the attenuator for the filter modulation, into the new attenuator, feeding the mult with the envelope. Oh, there's the mistake. I've got the output of this attenuator going into the mult. This should be LFO feeding the first mult. There we go, that's better. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, the pitch swoop. So we're going to go out of the attenuator into the rate input. No, that's not what we're doing. We're doing a pitch swoop. What's going on with my brain today? But you know what? We lost the pulse width rate modulation that we had in the, well, it was the patch from the last video. But at the very beginning of this video, I removed that modulation. So I want to bring that back. So I'm going to use a Splix. It's patched into the mult that's got the filter envelope feeding it. And I'll patch that into the rate input of our, why isn't this working? Patch into the rate input. There it is. I patched it wrong again. Okay, so we're using the filter envelope generator to modulate the rate of the LFO, which is modulating the pulse width of our oscillators. Okay, that sounds good. We're on the right track. What I wanted to do before my brain stopped working earlier is modulate the pitch of one of the oscillators, like this. Now, of course, I can just do it manually. There's nothing wrong with that. Sounds really cool. Okay, so I'm going to use the envelope to modulate the pitch of oscillator 2. So I've got to put a dead patch into the pitch input of oscillator 3 so it doesn't get modulated. And I'm going to go out of our envelope generator into the pitch input of oscillator 2. That's out of the attenuator, sorry, which is being fed by the filter envelope generator. And then the trick is, of course, finding a value on the attenuator that sounds good. Not quite in tune, but just gotta, oh, that's too far. Small movements, this is tricky to get in tune. Now, if I'm going to change my chord, the other trick is going to be to make sure that I always play the same note second. So I'm going to try to play F sharp second each time, and I'll just switch between G major and D major, I guess. Okay, that'll do it for this patch. Went a step further than I had planned with that pitch modulation, but it's kind of cool. You can use it or not. Oh, you know what would have been really cool is if I patched an expression pedal into this CV control for that attenuator controlling the pitch modulation. Then I could control when I wanted it to happen with my foot. But this video's long enough. That's something you can try on your own time, I guess, if you want. But that'll do it for this patch. I've got one more video that I'll post in a few weeks that's an extension of these concepts. The next one is a fairly complex 5-voice drone. But for now, I'm going to add in some reverb and that flanger I used in the last video that I'm crazy about now and just seems to work great with these types of patches. And I'll play you out. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.